Good evening, and welcome to episode 97 of the Political Mike podcast. It was around 8:30 p.m. on Saturday night, January the 7th, in Memphis, Tennessee, according to a statement by Memphis police, when Memphis officers pulled over a vehicle for suspected reckless driving. Tyree Nichols, a 29-year-old black man, was pulled over by police for alleged reckless driving. According to Nichols' mother, Rovon Wells, Tyree was 2 minutes away from his home when he was pulled over. Officials said that Memphis officers approached Nichols, who ran away. Officials also say that they then pursued Nichols after he ran and apprehended him. Attorneys for Nichols' family said the body camera footage of the incident showed that Nichols did not originally run when being approached by officers. They say Nichols told police he was just trying to get home from FedEx, where he worked, and yelled for his mother 3 times toward the end of the video, who lived nearby. Body camera footage shows the initial altercation. An officer warns Nichols that he's going to tase him and beat him, as various officers hold him on the ground and yell at him. Nichols' tone remained calm, and at one point, he told the cops, "You guys are really doing a lot right now." He managed to break free from the officers as they appear to try to deploy a stun gun on him, and he ran away. Several officers later could be seen in body camera footage grouped with Nicholas, standing over him as he's on the ground. As 2 officers hold him down, a third kicks him. A 4th officer comes over with a baton, and the officers pick Nichols up from the ground and hold him up while officers appear to strike him in the face and torso. As Nichols falls to his knees, several officers kneel and lean over him, while another appears to stand a few feet away watching. Additional officers run into the frame. At least one officer kicks Nichols while he is on the ground. About 3 minutes from the first kick, they began to step away. They eventually drag him into the street and lean him up against a car, as he appears to have his hands behind his back. Nichols remained slumped next to the car for roughly 20 minutes before officers first attempt to render him aid. Several minutes later, EMTs appeared to lean over Nichols before an ambulance appeared. The footage showed officers beating him and using spraying pepper spray as he began yelling for his mother. He could be heard screaming "Mom" at least 3 times, and the officers yelled multiple times at Nicholas to give me your hands, despite the fact that his hands were currently tied behind his back. After the incident, Nichols complained of having a shortness of breath and was transported by ambulance to Memphis St. Francis Hospital in critical condition. Shortly thereafter, on January the 10th, he died after being detained by Memphis police. My guest tonight, Mr. Philip K. Howard, would argue that it was the failure of public unions that resulted in what we saw unfold in Memphis, Tennessee, in the early part of January last month. Mr. Philip K. Howard is a writer, an author, and a New York Times best-selling author. He's also an attorney. He has written on the effects of modern law and bureaucracy on human behavior and the workings of society. He has written policies endorsed by 4 United States presidents. Since 1983, he has become a co-founding partner at Howard, Darby, and Levin, and special advisor to SEC Task Force of Simplification. During his career, he also served as a consultant to other government officials and agencies, started Common Good, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that advocates simplifying government. And in August 2016, Common Good launched a Take Charge campaign. Mr. Howard is also the author of the best-selling book, The Death of Common Sense, The Collapse of the Common Good, and Life Without Lawyers. He just released a new book, Not Accountable, that gives the first ever legal argument for why public unions are clearly unconstitutional. Police, teachers, and nurses unions, he says, are the primary examples. Mr. Howard, thank you so much for being on the Political Mic tonight.
Nice being with you, Mike.
So, Mr. Howard, walk us through what took place in Memphis, Tennessee on January the 7th, and why do you believe, as an attorney, as someone who's well-versed with policy as it pertains to bureaucracy, that it's the failure of public unions that resulted in the tragedy that has now sparked and reignited the national call for police reform, for laws to curb police brutality? Please, sir.
Right. Well, please, these incidents seem to be happening, every few months, right? We have, Louisville, we have Minneapolis, it's been going on for years. And reformers have a variety of ideas, including better civilian review boards, better training, different staffing rules for the police. But very few of these things happen because the unions prevent them. So, for example, there's something like 160 civilian review boards in the United States out of 18,000 police departments. And that's because the unions have opposed them. Now, I don't think that what happened in Memphis is solely because of the union. You know, it's very hard to analyze what makes a bad police culture. But what clearly happened is that those officers who were young, also they were all black, you know, so they were young, they were not well trained, and they didn't have anybody on their team who was experienced in dealing with situations that can get out of hand. I don't know why this got out of hand. It just seems so stupid that this guy pulled over for traffic and ends up getting beaten to death. I mean, it's just horrible and inexcusable. But one of the reasons why there wasn't an experienced officer on the team is because the union contract say the experienced officers get to the easier duty. You know, they get to take the daytime shift in the suburbs, not the nighttime shift in a somewhat sketchy neighborhood. So it's, you know, there's a lot wrong with police departments in America today, and no one's able to fix them. The causes are complex, but you can't fix them without the basic tools of management, accountability for upholding values of, you know, being respectful of people on the street, without the ability to assign senior cops in difficult situations and such. You have to be able to deploy assets in a sensible way. And the union contracts don't allow, there's no accountability. Accountability is something like 0.02% in the police department. In Minneapolis, the cop who killed George Floyd was named Derek Chauvin, was thought to be tightly wound, sort of an odd guy, and probably not appropriate to be on the beat with a deadly weapon. But the police chief had no authority to terminate him and didn't even have authority to reassign him. And in the prior decade, the Minneapolis Police Department had 2,600 complaints from citizens that were considered serious complaints. 12 resulted in discipline, 12, of which the longest, the most harsh discipline was a 40-hour suspension. So you have these things that have developed in the police departments, you know, something called the blue wall of silence, you know, where nobody will rat out another cop. And then in the case of I don't know what happened in Memphis, but in the case of the George Floyd situation, you had these 3 or 4 young cops just standing there looking while he had his knee on Floyd's neck for 9 minutes. You know, well, a culture where people don't feel empowered to say, hey, wait a minute, that's the wrong thing to do here. You know, you could be killing this person. You need a culture where people are trained to intervene, not a culture where people are trained never to intervene. You know, and so that's what's happened. So, you know, why the Memphis police did what they did is probably complex, but why we don't fix it, I would say the biggest villain are the unions.
And you know, the New York Times also reported that the union representing the fire department employees that were involved in the Tyree Nichols murder said that the EMTs who responded and were fired did not have sufficient information when they were dispatched. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that sounds like a management error. I mean, that's not a, that's, life is filled with things that go wrong. So that's something that went wrong. Beating someone to death is not something that went wrong. That's law enforcement officers who are out of control, in a culture where the cops don't rein in the other cops.
So in your latest work, Not Accountable, this book you indicate in the first chapter is unlike your previous books because it's not a story of a flawed governing philosophy applied by people acting in good faith. Rather, it's a story of raw power and democratic disloyalty. You say that you describe the sources of power and how public employee unions came to acquire it, and how unions have corroded democratic governance. Could you elaborate?
Sure.
Or-
So unions, private unions, steel workers unions and car workers and stuff, there was really a need for those, especially 100 years ago when there wasn't regulation. The big companies were mangling people in the factories. People were dying in unsafe conditions as well as not being paid fair wages. So there was organization that was important to do in the trade unions. There was no such power in the public unions because people who were in favor of trade unions, such as FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, believed that it was clearly a conflict of interest to allow the public workers to unionize because they would be bargaining against the public good. And so it's one thing for a trade union to negotiate against an employer. And by the way, in those negotiations, both sides are at risk because if the unions ask for too much, the company will go out of business or it will move out of town and they'll all lose their jobs. So it's a very limited thing. In the case of government, if you bargain against government can't move. Just the taxpayers pay. If you have ridiculous work rules, what's going to happen? You just have an inefficient government. Does not work, doesn't have schools at work or whatever. But the worst thing, the difference is that it would be unlawful in private business unions for the union and the management to somehow collude. Let's come up with a deal that hurts the shareholders or whatever the deal would be. Public bargaining is nothing but collusion. The public unions spend billions actually, of dollars to get favorable politicians elected, and then they sit down on the same side of the table and say, what are you going to give me now? It's not a negotiation, it's a payoff. And so what we've had, and these unions were only authorized in the late 60s, kind of as an accident of the rights revolution. There was no scandal, there was no need to unionize. Most public officials were already covered by civil service laws and all of that. So you didn't have any danger, you didn't have any sort of arbitrary activity. The union officials just wanted power and they got it. And for 50 years, they've been exercising control over government so that, for example, schools in inner cities are horrible and we elect mayors and governors to fix them and they don't have the authority to do it. So what's the point of having democracy if you elect somebody to fix the broken school or a bad police department and they don't have any authority? So we're electing figureheads. And I think that's clearly unconstitutional.
So what do you say to those that say, Mr. Howard, I hear you, but the First Amendment still guarantees the right, the freedom of assembly. And there's still some labor abuses out there. And so, these unions have proven, over the course of the 20th century and even now we're in the early part of the 21st century that this is probably the only source of recourse many, laborers have to get, better working conditions, a collective bargaining.
I would say that's all inaccurate. They needed recourse with private business. I agree with that. But there was no scandal. They didn't need recourse against the government. They were already protected by civil service laws and others. They just wanted power. And if you look at these agreements, they're not about safety. They're designed for inefficiency. This principal of a school can't go in and look at and observe a teacher without giving advance notice and carefully controlled circumstances. We get a pandemic. The teachers say, well, there's nothing in our contract about teaching a pandemic. There's nothing in our contract about doing distance teaching. So what happens? Everything has to be negotiated. So you end up getting jurisdictions where teachers are only working 3 hours a day. And what's the result of that? Kids, real people, lost in the inner city 17 percentage points of accomplishment during COVID from the prior period. This week, Baltimore announced that 23 schools in Baltimore, not one student was proficient in math. Chicago found 55 schools where not one student in Chicago was proficient in either the subject of math or English. This is a scandal. I mean, and all this needed is management. So if you take a good charter school, for example, there's one in New York called Success Academy, and it often shares the buildings with the public schools. The children are picked by lottery. So it's the same cohort of children. In one of these charter schools, was ranked 37th in the state of New York in academic achievement in Harlem. 37th in the state of New York. The school in the same building with the same cohort of students was ranked 1,694th out of 2,400 students. What's the difference there? The difference is you have people who have a culture of accomplishment in the charter school. They make sure people are doing a good job. You know, when you have no accountability, the problem is not that there are lots of bad people in government. There aren't. I think most people in government want to do the right thing. So, but if there's no accountability, it almost guarantees that the culture is bad, because you know that performance doesn't matter. Why should you go the extra mile when nobody else is? And so it's like letting the air out of the balloon. You know, people go to a place and they're kind of become resigned to the fact that it's a lousy school. And who loses when it's a lousy school? It's the kids. And they don't have a chance in life because these schools are lousy. And why are they lousy? Because the teachers union won't let them be fixed.
So in your book, you know, you indicate, and actually the foreword of the book is written by the former governor of Indiana, Mitch Daniels. He, you know, praises, you know, the fact that you have been involved or spearheaded a lot of policies that he believes that the United States should have adopted a long time ago. Some of those reforms ended up incorporated into the Inflation Reduction Act that was signed by President Biden into law in 2021. Which of your reforms were incorporated into the bipartisan infrastructure bill? I misspoke. Infrastructure bill that was signed into law by President Biden.
The little not-for-profit that I chair, called commongood.org, we do targeted studies or books, and then we come up with very specific proposals on how to fix them. So one of the problems with trying to build green infrastructure in this country is that it's very hard to get permits when you have to get approval, say, to build a power line from every county over which the power line runs. You know, you could spend 100 years getting approval from every county. I mean, it's like this crazy mess. And so we found that the delays in giving permits for new transportation projects, new power projects, more than doubles the cost of infrastructure. So that means you get half the infrastructure you should for the tax dollar. We also found that lengthy environmental review is almost always harmful to the environment because it delays these new projects that actually cure bottlenecks and are more efficient power lines or the like. So that paper, which I wrote in 2015, so now 8 years ago, was debated. It's been endorsed by presidential candidates on both sides and such. And some of those reforms, which involve giving more authority to officials to decide what's really needed in environmental review, you put deadlines in it, all those sorts of things were included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill.
So, in your view, why have police unions, teachers unions, and other public sector unions built a fortress against supervisory decisions?
It's power. The people, if you're, it's human nature not to want to be accountable, right? It's the allegory of Plato's cave, where everybody's down in the bottom of a cave and they just see shadows. They don't know really what's going on outside, but they're doing fine in the cave. So nobody will come out of the cave because it's secure, and so it's kind of human nature to want to protect because you fear that somebody's going to be unfair or whatever. And I'm all for putting speed bumps in to prevent unfairness. So the unions say, you support us, you'll never be accountable. You'll have your job for life. Well, that's true. They've provided that. And then the unions say, and no manager can ever ask you to do anything unless we approve it. So you have the situation where literally, if like an office moves in the federal government, they have to collectively bargain who sits at what desk. Think of that. I mean, management, if there's a new version of Microsoft Word that goes on the computer, that has to be bargained about how it's used, how it's trained. It's crazy. It's this form of, it's like a warped personal relationship where people want power just for its own sake, just to show that they've got the power. Well, the unions at this point have power, I think, power for its own sake. Government's a horrible place to work because the unions don't let it be a place with pride and energy.
So on that note on collective bargaining, you also discuss in your book in chapter 1 that collective bargaining agreements effectively bar the most important management tool, which is accountability.
Right.
You say that collective bargaining also preclude basic management choices, including reassigning personnel and allocating responsibilities for projects. You say that they restrict mundane managerial prerogatives, such as dropping in on a classroom or asking people how to improve things. There are those who argue that, look, collective bargaining is an effective tool for those who don't have the same economic means to fight for their rights as employers against their employees, many of which are heads of huge corporations. I'm thinking back a few years ago to the Amazon strike that took place.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a lot of progressives who are on the side of that strike, of the strikers against
Right.
Amazon. Could you explain why you describe collective bargaining agreements in this manner in light of some of the most recent strikes we've seen, where it seems like the underdogs are those who are working for minimum wage or just a little bit.
Right. Well, now you're going into private sector union. I mean, I think there's a lot of improvements. I mean, one of the things I'm going to do is to host forums that talk about what the deal for teachers should be and the deal for cops should be. I think being a cop's a hard job. Being a teacher is a hard job. You really have to spill out your emotions, So they need the freedom to be themselves and such. So if I were in charge, and who knows, maybe I will be, if I were in charge, I'd pay teachers, cops 20% more, but I'd have them be manageable. But what you're talking about is a real problem in American society that has to do with low-wage commodity jobs, where there's no ladder to climb. The rungs in the ladder have gone out in some of these distribution warehouses or in fast food restaurants or the like. And it's a real problem there that the private work, they're not so much safety issues. They're not like the old issues. They're kind of marketplace issues. These businesses have become automated to a point where, and globalization is such that, if you pay people too much, the job then goes to a robot, or goes overseas. So my view is that one of the problems in the private sector is, in my view, is probably not generally a union solution, but it's a federal, like an earned income tax credit solution, where I think it's really important for people to make a living wage and to feel pride in the job they're doing. But you can't support somebody at $12 an hour, much less $8 an hour, And so I think the government ought to top people up. I think, in my view, the federal government ought to make it so that everybody who's working and wants to work gets paid a living wage. And if the company is paying, let's pick a number, $12 an hour, the government pays another $8 or another $10, because I think people need the dignity of supporting their families.
So you also discuss in your book, you talk about how the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina resulted in the replacement of New Orleans public school system, but in the replacement of the New Orleans public school system by an independent charter school, and how that became like a light switch. You describe it as like a light turning on. Things became more efficient. And yet you argue in your book, you say that this actually improved high school graduation rates and narrowed the gaps between racial groups as it
Right.
pertains to education, higher education. Could you elaborate on the connection between the transition from public school system to independent charter school,
Right.
and how
Right.
that relates with these numbers?
Okay. So I'm a um, the reason charter schools. By the way, the studies in charter schools suggest that 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 they can be really much more effective in the inner city than the public schools. They also suggest that they don't make any difference in the suburbs. Charter schools are no better than the public schools. So, I'm not sure why that is, but it may be that some of the kids coming to school in the inner city have such difficult personal family situations and such that they need more, they need more energy, they need more socialization to make them, want to learn and be able to learn. So that's my supposition, but I'm not an education expert. But in the case of New Orleans, you had, kind of, as many cities do, a terrible public school system. It was all flooded out, so all the schools started, all the teachers lost their jobs, there were no schools to go to. And so they needed to figure out how to get schools up and running again, and they let people set up their own charter schools. And what that did is it didn't guarantee that every school was good, but it unleashed human initiative. And you know this because you have your own show, right? You know what human initiative can do. So you have people coming in a neighborhood in New Orleans say, let's do it this way. And then you have people in another neighborhood in New Orleans saying, let's do it the other way. And just the fact that there's this human energy at work saying, let's try to make it as good as we can make it, not just follow the rules, not just plod along, but actually make it up, gave enormous energy, and the schools were more successful.
So you also talk about how someone who was you call a New Dealer, Jim Landis, conducted a report that was presented before President John F. Kennedy, then President-elect Kennedy. And this report concluded that the administrative flaw in post-World War II government was sluggishness. Federal employees, it says, were basically content and happy. Civil
Yeah.
service systems regularized pay and personal procedures. State and local governments were no better or worse than the people and the Moors in those communities. Could you elaborate on the implications of that report and how it changed the way the federal government approached public?
Yeah. It's interesting. There's a problem with civil service, and I've worked on civil service reforms with people over the years. Um, there is a tendency in government, because you're not at risk in the same way you are in the private sector, losing your job. There's a tendency of, like, for example, if you're in a big government agency in Washington, you're not dealing with real people. You're pushing paper from one side to the other, right? And so it's very hard to get excited about that. Whereas if you're in a small town in Georgia or anywhere, the people who are affected by your decisions in government, you know them. So government tends to work better in these small situations, and it tends to become sluggish in Washington. I happen to think Washington is a really horrible place, and I proposed in a book that we move the national capital. It doesn't matter where. Just move it to a place where there's real people who wake up in the morning and feel they've got to, perform for the people around them. But government, Washington now is filled with 10,000 interest groups. It's been so long since anything important happened in Washington, people don't think it can happen. The last time we had really big change was the 1960s. when we had the civil rights revolution, we had the environmental revolution, got rid of gender discrimination, we discovered unsafe products, with Ralph Nader, and had safety legislation. All those things happened in one decade. And, we're overdue for a change. And, but the change is going to come from the outside. It's not going to come from the people within government, because they've been sort of trained to follow the rules.
And on that note, President Kennedy also signed an executive order that was aimed at encouraging more collective bargaining. Executive Order 10988 in 1962 authorized collective bargaining in the federal government.
Right.
And the order stated that its aim was to promote the efficient administration of the government and effective conduct of public business. But but the actual motivation was political, and historians
yeah. I mean, what a joke. It was not for everybody knew right away what was happening, which is it was a payoff to the unions for supporting Kennedy in the election. He felt he had to do it. But nobody knew how bad it would be. They didn't know that the union, they thought they'd be like the private sector. Maybe the unions get a little more money. Fine. I think public employees, are certainly senior ones, are underpaid, and people like teachers and cops. No one had any concept that what would happen is that they would demand 200-page collective bargaining agreements where the provisions are designed for inefficiency. They're not designed for safety. They're not designed for better work conditions. They're designed for feather bedding. They're designed for inefficiency. They're designed to waste taxpayers' money. I mean, the trash collection in big cities like New York, Chicago costs twice what the private carters do, because they can't do it. Cleaning the subway cars in New York costs 2 to 3 times what a private person would do. Private party. Well, all that money can be used to take care of the homeless or lower subway fares. I mean, all these inefficiencies actually, they're immoral, because they hurt the public that the employees have a sworn duty of loyalty to try to protect.
And there's salient differences between trade union and public sector bargaining. What are those differences between trade union and public sector bargaining?
Okay, one, the incentives are different. In a private trade union, both sides are at risk. If you demand too much on either side, you're going to lose your job, or your business is going to be hurt. You're going to lose your workers. They go on strike. So both sides are at risk. There's no risk to the unions in a government bargain. They can demand whatever they can get away with, and the taxpayers have to pay. It doesn't come out of the pocket of the politician who's giving it. Indeed, a lot of what they get are sweetheart pensions that are inflated beyond what are reasonable. Like, you get double the pension because you spike overtime in the last year of your employment, that sort of thing. And those pension payments, only come due from the taxpayers long after the politician who gave them is out of office. So they're giving away money of your children, or of you when you're a little older. And as I said earlier, the negotiation itself is not a real negotiation. It's collusive. The public unions, people don't really understand how powerful they are. They collect about $5 billion a year in dues, most of which is used for political activity. And 10% of the delegates at the Democratic National Convention are members of the teachers union. If there was a senior state legislator in New Jersey who had proposed a really modest reform to let local school boards have a say in how the pensions worked for the teachers. The teachers put huge efforts in and got him kicked out of office. John Kasich was governor of Ohio. He passed some reforms that were going to save the taxpayers billions of dollars. The unions didn't like them. They brought in national money of tens of millions of dollars, had a referendum, and had it reversed. So we're talking about people, we're not talking about an interest group. We're talking about a huge cohort. There's 7 million members of public unions in this country. A huge cohort of people who are dedicated to stopping the reform of government, and they do that with political power. But as FDR said, they have a duty of loyalty to the public. They've sworn a duty of loyalty to serve the public. So which one are they doing? Are they serving the public, or are they're trying to harm the public? And I make the case in this book, in a 5-point indictment, that they're clearly trying to harm the public. And we're not talking about salaries here. Everybody has the right, and again, I would pay people more to a fair salary. We're talking about accountability and manageability and things like that.
So, also in your book, you say that bargaining over public choices is a recipe for collusion, not good government. Could you explain?
Sure. In the case of New Jersey, the teachers union staffs the campaign headquarters of the person running for governor. They provide the staff. They pay for buses and pay for people to go to demonstrations. They do all of that. They get all the signatures for the person to get on the ballot. They are the principal campaign staff of this person. Then the person gets elected. And what do? They show up at his office and say, "What can you give me?" That's not the way private bargaining works. It's collusion. It's a payoff. I mean, it's unethical. It should be unconstitutional. I argue you couldn't do that in the private sector. And who's the loser? The public isn't in that office asking what they're going to get. All that money is coming out of, you pick it. It's coming out of public services to deal with homelessness. It's coming out of public services to do housing. It's coming out of public services to provide food. It's doing public services to provide training. All those extra dollars are going into inefficiency that hurts the public.
So this past December, President Biden got a lot of criticism for how he dealt with what was described as, the biggest labor battle of his administration. Rather than allowing the nation's railroad workers to exercise their right to strike, The Guardian argued this past December, they said that Biden used his power to intervene and force them to accept a deal that a majority of those workers found to be unacceptable. They said his ability to do this rests on the vagaries of the Railway Labor Act, but all you really need to understand is this: nobody forced him to side with the railroad companies over the workers. They said that was a choice. What is your response to that criticism that the Biden?
I don't consider myself an expert in private labor law. I've sort of steeped myself in the public labor law, and I can tell you the history of that in granular detail. But private unions, the trade unions, have declined from about a third of the workforce 50 or 60 years ago to now only 6% of the workforce. And people disagree a little bit about why that is, but part of the reason is that regulation took the place of one of the reasons we had unions. They're not really safety issues anymore, and there are lots of other provisions of law that give people kind of a fair deal. I still think unions are really important because they keep other companies, the non-unionized companies, honest. So a company like Toyota, for example, is not unionized in the United States. But they have things like workers' councils to safeguard against unfair firings. They have all sorts of labor practices that are really fair, because if they didn't have those labor forces, the workforce might get angry and unionize. So the unions put pressure on non-union shops to do a good job. I can't really, I don't know enough to opine about whether the President Biden was being fair or unfair to the railroad workers. So if I said anything, it would be arbitrary and inaccurate. I think that what President Biden had in mind, however, was that the economy of this country really depends on the railroads. And, and similar things happened with Truman and the steel workers back when. And he really didn't feel he could afford to let there be a strike.
Yeah. So the Supreme Court, last month, January the 10th, heard oral arguments in a case that was, widely watched by labor unions that were fearful that the conservative majority could undercut the appeal for workers to strike and sap authority from the National Labor Relations Board. The question the court was presented with was whether employers could sue unions accused of destroying property as part of a labor dispute in the state court. The case was Glacier Northwest Incorporated versus International Brotherhood of Teamsters, and that stems from a 2017 labor dispute in which workers at a Washington concrete company went on strike in protest of contract negotiation delays, and the company, Glacier Northwest, filed a lawsuit in state court against the union Teamsters that represents the truck drivers involved. They argue that they should be compensated for the cost of cement that became unusable after those workers walked off the job. The company, Glacier Northwest, argued that the stoppage was intentionally timed to ruin cement, while the Teamsters, the union, said they were careful to prevent the mix from hardening by returning cement trucks to the property and keeping them running before striking. The union argued before the Supreme Court that the right to strike is crucial to the collective bargaining process and allows a union to time a strike to apply substantial economic pressure.
Strikes me as a little odd that the company would sue unless they had a contract with the workers where they promised not to strike and destroy the concrete. Then it would be a contract claim. But companies in general bear the risk of lots of market conditions, including presumably not getting along with their workers.
You say in your book, you argue that you believe that governments have become impervious to reform and that elected officials no longer have effective authority over the operations of government. What do you mean by that?
Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago, wanted the teachers to open up the schools. During COVID, other schools were opening up, and the teachers wouldn't come because their contract didn't require them to come. They just said no. The Bloomberg administration, Mayor Bloomberg, wanted to have a rule that said they were going to have some sample testing of schools to see how teachers were doing in different settings. And the teachers union simply turned around and went to the legislature, and they got a law saying it's illegal to do sample testing. If somebody gets elected mayor and they want to make things work better, the collective bargaining agreement is not coterminous with the electoral cycle. So the mayor is bound to manage it or to not manage it the way the collective bargaining agreement says. He has no authority to change the way the police department works, no authority to change the way the schools work. And then when the collective bargaining agreement comes up, if the mayor, elected by the voters to run the city, whatever the city is, if the mayor wants to make a change, in many states, including the state of New York, if the union disagrees, their disagreement gets resolved by arbitrators. Well, who elected the arbitrators? Voters elected the mayors. Voters didn't elect the unions. They didn't elect the arbitrators, and then they make a decision. And then if there's still a stalemate in New York State, the law is that the collective bargaining agreement runs indefinitely with cost of living improvements in it. So you have this permanent government. We have a permanent government through contract. The Constitution, and James Madison talked a lot about this, has a provision that's really never been acted upon by the courts, but it's clear what it means. A provision in Article 4 that says, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government. And what they meant is not a Republican Party, form of government, but the Republic form of government is where you elect an official who then has the freedom and the responsibility to act on his or her best judgment to govern. That's what it means. You elect people who govern on behalf, using their best judgment on behalf of the people. And the Republican form of government clause, called the guarantee clause, means that you can't give away that power, any part of that power, to a private party. Like they were worried about aristocrats, being able to run something back then, or, quote, any favored class. So what's happened with collective bargaining is that by authorizing collective bargaining, it's not a kind of a right, that's not like a right of free speech. It's a legislative authorization by giving unions a power that no other private group has, the power that the government has to agree with them. So you name whatever interest group you want. They don't have that power. Only the unions have that power. By giving that power, they've ceded governing power, a kind of a veto, to the unions that I believe and argue in my book, Not Accountable. I argue that is unconstitutional because the people we elect no longer have the authority.
And of course, in chapter 3, you talk about Madison's, belief that each department should have a will of its own. Basically, you say that the greater danger that Madison believed was for power to be consolidated into any self-appointed authority, and of course, that's in response to you advocating for executive employees to be hired based on merit and ability rather than on political loyalty, and that's as you're addressing.
That's what the civil service. So we have a system where politics is important, but we wanted to have a professional civil service that would transcend each political, elected official, so that there'd be some continuity when one party took power and then another party took power, government would still operate. And that was the civil service system, and it was supposed to be based on merit. It was not a tenure system. It's not a lifetime job. It was supposed to be one where the supervisors are allowed to make judgments about who's doing a good job and who's not. And there was a law passed 100 years ago that said the one thing that people shouldn't be able to do is fire somebody just because they don't like their politics. So there was a mechanism set up to allow an independent body to make sure people aren't fired for the wrong reason. But it wasn't a legal trial. It wasn't tenure. But that's what it's become. It's become basically, public employees have, as I said earlier, virtual immunity from accountability. 99% of all public federal employees get a fully successful rating. Are they all that good? I don't think so. 2 out of 95,000 teachers in Illinois over an 18-year period got dismissed for performance. Illinois, sort of lousy schools. Are all those teachers that good? No. I mean, some people, they can be perfectly nice people. They're just not cut out to be a teacher. Teaching is a hard job.
And of course, the Pendleton Act of 1883, signed by President Chester Alan Arthur in the aftermath of the assassination of President Garfield, was seen as such a direct attack on President Garfield's, I think, arch nemesis, Senator Roscoe Conkling of New York, because those were the days in which once your political party wins the White House, there are certain favors that are
right. Well, the spoil system. So the spoil system, I mean, it was pathetic. I mean, the spoil system, which was put in by Andrew Jackson initially as a good government mechanism, because at least people would be accountable to voters. That was the idea. Turned into being a payoff mechanism. Political supporters got jobs that they didn't have to perform at. They could do a lousy job. They still kept their job because they helped somebody get elected. So the civil service system was designed to get rid of that form of hiring and hire people professionally. So now fast forward 140 years, because that was 1883. Here we are in, 2023. What we have is a new spoil system. It doesn't matter if people do their job or not, they keep their job. Except it's now not dependent on political loyalty, it's permanent. So there's not even occasional electoral accountability. So we have unions that basically have a permanent workforce that the people we elect can't manage.
And you also talk about President Theodore Roosevelt in 1902 clarifying, the Civil Service Commission order, to give a permanency of tenure into public service,
Right.
Which was inconsistent with the efficiency of the service.
Right.
President Roosevelt clarified the order, by saying nothing contained in the rule should be construed to require the examination of witnesses or any trial or hearing.
Right.
And these executive orders were codified in the Lloyd La Follette Act of 1912, requiring
Right.
notice of writing, a chance to respond in writing, but no examination of witnesses, trial, or
Right.
hearing. For
Right.
those who may be a little confused about the implications of this, could you explain?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the effects of getting rid of the spoil system is it created a natural organizing group because public employees kept their jobs year after year, right? And so naturally, and this was when the private sector was unionizing, they said, well, we want to protect ourselves. So they kept wanting to get more security, and they were started being politically active, which was banned in the federal government during the New Deal, something called the Hatch Act, because they became such a potent political force because there were so many public employees. It became an incredibly powerful political force. And so Teddy Roosevelt, who had been an original civil service reformer, saw this happening and said, look, it's hard enough to manage government, but it's impossible if you can't judge who's doing a good job and who's not. So we're going to retain the power in supervisors to decide, hold people accountable, who's doing a good job or not, but we will have this one safety valve to make sure people aren't fired for the wrong reasons, and you can appeal it up to this Civil Service Commission, but it's not going to be a trial at law. How do you prove it's doing a good job? How do you prove it's a good teacher? How do you prove who writes well or cooperates? A lot of the things about doing a good job is just not provable. And so he wanted to affirm that. And the reality is, and I think people who've worked in government know this, and this is what Jim Landis wrote in his report to President Kennedy, 50 years later. The reality is people in government don't want to go around firing people. It's just, it's awkward, right? I mean, who wants to have personal conflict? Who wants to do anything? So the problem in managing government, because you don't have outside market pressures, you can't, you don't have the profit motive and stuff. The problem is to get people to work hard, particularly in an agency. A teacher is in front of the children. A teacher has pressure all the time. The cop is on the street. Cop has pressure all the time. But for people who are not dealing with the public, the tendency is to just let it ride. So there was never any scourge of unfairness or firings in the bureaucracy, except, I want to make one except, during the red hunts during the McCarthy era, when they were afraid that government was taken over by communists, in the early 1950s, and they did investigations of like 1 million people or something, and ultimately found 200 or 300 maybe were communists.
So another thing that you advocate for in your latest book is abandoning the legal requirement that supervisors prove performance traits that are not susceptible to objective proof, such as competence, energy, and effectiveness.
Right. That's right.
Okay. Why is this an adequate solution in your view?
Well, first of all, this in your own experience. There are people you you think do a good job, and there are people you don't think you're doing a good job. The people you want to work with and people you don't want to work with. And sometimes that can be for the wrong reason, so you want to safeguard it. So in my world, I would set up site-based committees to guard against unfairness or arbitrariness. You still have things like anti-discrimination laws in place, so we're not doing anything with those. And so, like in a school, let's say the principal decides somebody's not being an effective teacher and says, I really think you ought to go try something else in life. The teacher objects. I would have a parent-teacher committee. People know who the good teachers are and aren't. I'd give them the power to veto it. Fine. But that doesn't take a year. It's just a judgment by someone else. So people making judgments, people need to be free to do a job the best they can. Now they're not. They're laden with bureaucracy. And other people need to be free to make judgments about them. And if we don't trust people, which nobody trusts anybody anymore in this society, if we don't trust anybody, then let's give another group the power to veto it, but based on their judgment, not based on proof, because you can't prove most human traits. You just can't prove them. I mean, there are 1,000 ways to skin a cat, and some people will figure out how to do it, and some people won't.
So the last question I want to ask you, Mr. Howard, for the evening, is in your view, the president, of course, is in his just past the second year mark of his presidency. There's a campaign gearing up for the 2024 election. We already have 2 declared candidates on the Republican side. Nikki Haley announced that she's going to be running for the presidency. Officially, she announced yesterday. You have Donald Trump, who jumped into the race right after the midterm elections. In your view, which party is more poised to effectively deal with, the bureaucracy that seems to be serving as barriers in place of effective performance?
First of all, I think that's a really important question. I'm not a political person, but I'll say the following. The parties argue about policy, climate change, tax policy, immigration policy. Neither party has a coherent vision about how to fix the operating machinery of government. Neither party has a vision of how to make schools work better or to fix the toxic culture of police departments. And my goal in writing this book, Not Accountable, is to introduce into the public debates in 2024 the idea that we have to focus on making government work for the citizens of this country. And that's going to require changes. And both parties have to come up with a vision, because they've avoided the vision because it's too hard. The Democrats don't want to talk about it because they get a lot of political support for the public unions. I understand that. So it's going to be hard for them. The Republicans may not want to talk about it because, in my view, officials should have more authority. That's not what Republicans typically call for, right? They're trying to get rid of government authority, not give government officials more authority. I'm saying you got to give them the authority to do their jobs. And so I'm in the process of talking to whoever will talk to me about, including some potential presidential candidates from both sides, about these issues. And I'm talking to a Democratic think tank about the ways they could raise this without getting in too much trouble. A lot of Republican think tanks have called me up because they're not typically supported by the public union, so it's easier for them to take this on. But my goal is to make sure that the 2024 debates, the public sees visions about how to make government work better.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you, Mr. Howard, for a very intellectually stimulating discussion tonight. I'm forever grateful. And again, for those who may be interested on how to find Mr. Howard's latest work, Not Accountable, Mr. Howard, where can they find that latest work?
Well, you can find it in bookstores or Amazon or wherever. Not Accountable, rethinking the constitutionality of public employee unions. It's, I think it's a scandal. And the good news is the book is really short. So it's only 160 pages long.
Well, thank you so much again, Mr. Howard.
Again, nice to be with you, Mike.
Awesome. Again, I just want to encourage the viewers, as I do every week, to challenge the sources of news that you do plug into, to refrain from misinformation and sketchy sources of news. and to challenge the sources of news that you do tune into. Thank you so much for tuning in. I look forward to seeing you all view the next show that we have lined up next week. Thank you, Mr. Howard, for what you brought to the table. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and conclude episode 97 of the Political Mike podcast. Thank you all.
Great. Bye.
Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mike podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePollyMike, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.